All right. It's good to be back in 2 Samuel. Open your Bibles with me to chapter 13. Some of us, we might not remember where 2 Samuel is, right? It's been so long. 2 Samuel 13. Look at the title at the top of your sheet here, Unbridled Lust and Murder. Now, if you've read ahead, and I forgot or I failed to mention that Sunday to be reading chapter 13 of 2 Samuel this week, but in the event that you knew where we were and you took the initiative and you read that on your own, then you know where the unbridled lust and murder come in. A man by the name of Amnon, he had unfettered, unhindered lust for his half-sister. Okay, as unthinkable as that may be to us, that was his problem. And he eventually acted on this lust, and ultimately he is murdered because of it, even though it's 2 years after the fact, 2 years later. So we understand that part of the title, but why would I have in parentheses here, take two? Well, in what way is this take two? How have we seen unbridled lust and murder before? Hey, just go back 2 chapters, right? Go back to chapter 11, and instead of it being the son of David, Amnon, involved in this, who is it back in chapter 11 who doesn't control his lust and who ultimately commits murder? David, that's right. So that's why we are dealing with this title. Now, notice that I have some preface points here at the top of this sheet. You've heard me before mention the spiritual law of sowing and reaping. And it's not only a spiritual law, but this is also a law in the physical realm. There are at least 4 tenets of this law, and I've got them listed there. Number 1, you reap what? You reap what you sow, okay? Number 2, you reap what? You reap more than you sow. Think about that. If you planted 100 kernels of corn, now, most people are not going to do that. Farmers plant thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kernels. But if you planted 100 kernels of corn and all that you got back in the harvest were 100 kernels of corn, what would you do? You'd starve to death, right? You'd starve to death because all of the corn that you had put in the ground was corn that you could have just kept. If all you're going to wind up with is 100 kernels, then just keep the first 100 and eat those, right? But the law of sowing and reaping says you reap more than what you sow. Number 3, you reap what? Longer than what you sow. Now we think about perennial crops, and our minds may start to question that. Well, I don't know that it necessarily takes longer to harvest than it does to plant. But don't just think about perennial crops. What if you plant a peach seed? How long does it take to plant a peach seed? You know, less than an hour, depending on how big a hole your wife makes you dig, right? Less than an hour. You can plant a peach seed in 3 minutes. But if that tree lives and survives, how many years do you hope to get peaches off that tree? Hey, there's no telling. You reap longer than what you sow. And then number 4, others can reap what you sow. So if I do something, does it affect other people? Okay, all of these are tenets under the biblical law, the spiritual, physical law of sowing and reaping. I hope and trust we understand it. Now, people in the world in this modern day and time, people in the world who maybe are not familiar with the Bible or they reject the Bible, maybe they follow, I think it's an Eastern religion. What's the word that they'll sometimes use when they want to talk about bad things coming back on somebody? Karma. Karma, okay? In other words, you've got bad karma. You've been bad to people, you've done bad things, and it's going to come back on you. They use the term karma. We as Christians really, I know in everyday conversation we might pick up some of that lingo. We really don't need to use karma. Okay? I don't have any biblical basis for karma, but I've got biblical basis for saying, look, we live in a universe, a spiritual, physical, and moral universe where people reap what? They reap what they sow. So let's just call it sowing and reaping, and we don't have to delve into the Eastern religions and start talking about karma and stuff like that. We know that sowing and reaping holds true. Now look with me in 2 Samuel. Let me get my glasses on here. Let's actually back up to chapter 12 where we left off, I believe, at the end of June. Remember when Nathan the prophet came to David and he told him his parable about the rich man and the poor man that had the one little ewe lamb. And we know that in the parable, the rich man took from the poor man, he killed his little ewe lamb, and he used it to feed his guests. Somebody read verse 6. What did David say to Nathan in 12:6? Okay, he shall restore the lamb fourfold. There's a parable over in the New Testament. It's the parable of the talents, I believe it is. It might be the parable of the pounds. I get those two parables confused because they're so similar. But in one of those parables, when you come down to the one called the wicked and slothful servant, as he's standing before the master in judgment, he basically, it's a parable of the pounds, I believe. He tells the master, he says, I knew that you were an austere man. In other words, I knew you were a serious, severe businessman, and that you reap where you don't sow, and things like this. And so I was afraid, and I took my pound, and I went and buried it, and here it is. But the master, if you remember, the master says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, you're going to be judged by your own words. By your own words, you said that you knew I'm a master who reaps where? Where I don't sow. In other words, I expect to have increase in income, even if it's from usury, so to speak. Okay. Here, this is interesting because in that parable of the judgment, the man is partially condemned, you might say, by his own words. Well, right here in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 6, David, by his own words, said, this man is going to restore fourfold. Now look at what happens following David saying that. What happened to the son born to Bathsheba, that first son? He died. I'm just going to put unnamed son. All right, number 2. Tonight and next Wednesday, Lord willing, we're going to read about the death of another son of David. His name is Amnon. Number 3, who killed Amnon? Absalom. Eventually here in 2 Samuel, what's going to happen to Absalom? He gets killed, number 3. And then when you come into 1 Kings, another son of David, Adonijah, he gets killed. Somebody count up. How many sons of David does he wind up losing from this point onward? At least 4. Isn't that strange? He loses the one with Bathsheba. He loses Amnon. He loses Absalom. And ultimately Adonijah also meets an early death. Folks, it's not karma. It's not bad juju, as some people use, speaking slang. It's none of that. There's a moral law in our universe. It's the law of sowing and reaping. Okay? Let's get into the text and let's learn what we can about this. Look at chapter 13 and verse 1. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister, whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now, it's interesting that both of these are called sons of David, Absalom and Amnon. So if they're both sons, that would make them what? That would make them brothers. But here Tamar is not described as being Amnon's brother. She's only described, or sister, she's only described as being whose sister? Absalom. Now, what did David do that was a departure from the biblical pattern regarding marriage? What did he do? He took multiple wives. That was a departure. That was not God's plan, still is not God's plan. that was a departure. So what happened here is in these royal harems, you had a lot of half-brothers and half-sisters because they all had the same father, but it was often the case that they would have different what? Different mothers. Now, what makes the bond so close between Absalom and this woman Tamar, guess what? They had the same what? They had the same mother. So this is a full brother and sister, Absalom and Tamar. Amnon, who is so infatuated, so attracted to Tamar, that's only his half-sister. Now, I'm not saying that makes it all right. I'm not saying that. There were still problems under the law of Moses with this. You can find them in Leviticus 18. I think also maybe Leviticus 22 or Deuteronomy 22. There were still problems with this, but I want you to understand why Absalom takes this so seriously. Because he and Tamar not only share the same daddy, they shared the same mama. This is his full-fledged sister, and when Amnon violates her and rapes her that we find in this chapter, Absalom's not having it. Okay? And that just gives you a little bit of the background that goes into that. So verse 2, Amnon, the son of David, he loved Tamar, beautiful, a lovely sister. By the way, isn't it interesting? The Bible tells us about both of these siblings right here. Apparently, both of them were what, physically speaking? They were good-looking people. Okay? Tamar here is described as being lovely. What about Absalom later on? He's got the hair. Okay? Do any of us men have hair envy, Beth? Don't answer that. Okay? He had so much hair that when you cut it, it weighed so much. He had that wonderful, what's that football player, that Hawaiian guy that does the shampoo commercials? Palomalu. He had Palomalu hair or better. Okay? And so the Bible tells us about both of these siblings that these were physically attractive people. Okay? Both Absalom and Tamar. That's interesting. Verse 2, Amnon was so distressed over his sister. Now here she's called his sister finally. We know it to be half-sister. He was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick. Now I'm not going to be able to raise my hand, and I don't think many of you are going to be able to raise your hand. But if in your life experience, if you have ever known somebody who was so infatuated, enamored, attracted, so deeply in love with somebody else that was unrequited love that they could not act upon, that they got physically sick. If you've ever known of that in real life, raise your hand. You neither? Say, I don't know about it. But apparently, from what I'm reading in the text here, he got to that point. Now, to explain to me, how can that happen to a man or to a woman? How can that happen? Okay, Gwen says they're sick in the head. You're on to something. In order for that to happen, what does that person have to do? I'm sorry? They have to obsess about it. Okay? You've got to allow yourself or force yourself, and there's a thin line between the two, but you've got to either make yourself or allow yourself to sit around pretty much all the time, and guess what you think about? Think about that person. Okay? Now, does the Bible ever teach us anything about guarding our thoughts or being deliberate in our thoughts and in our thought process? All the time, yeah. Some of us, it steps on our toes, right? But it tells us that. Okay? So I want you to understand that even though this might have been a rare problem, and obviously it is, none of us have ever known it in our lives, even though it might be a rare problem, I want you to know where it comes from. It comes from a person's allowing his or her mind to dwell on something they don't need to be dwelling on. Okay? So just file that away. Now, he became sick because she was a virgin daughter of the king is what you need to understand. And it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. Yeah, for a lot of reasons. Number one, as we've already pointed out, under the law of Moses, there were laws against incest. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and even though she's a half-sister, my understanding is that would still be covered in those laws. Number two, the virgin daughters of the royal monarch, the king, they were basically sequestered. What does it mean to be sequestered? They were locked away. Okay? They lived in their own quarters and they did not have public access. People could not come to them and things like that because what they were protecting is they are protecting the virginity of these women because it might be the king's decision one day that he wants to marry off his daughter for what intents or for what purposes? Political alliances a lot of times, okay? And it would be considered a grave insult if you're trying to enter into a political alliance with another king and you've promised him your daughter and come to find out she's not a virgin. Okay? So these women were sequestered and had no access basically to the general public. And so Amnon's just sick. I guess I thought about this when I was looking over it this afternoon. I guess maybe he had just seen her. Or maybe he was permitted to behold her passing through the palace or however. I don't know how he knew about her and how he knew so much about her beauty that he fixated on that and got sick over her. But somehow that was the case. Verse 3, but Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, other places known as Shammah, David's brother. So what relation does that make Jonadab to Amnon? Okay, this is a cousin. A lot of times do we make close friends of our cousins? Yeah. A lot of times we do. Now, sometimes, given family dynamics, sometimes we have cousins that we're not close to at all. And so you can have a wide range of experience with that. But it's not uncommon for cousins to be close. So here's this Jonadab that is described not as a cousin. How's he described in verse 3? A friend. Now, there are some key biblical concepts that we're dealing with in chapter 13. That's why we're taking at least 2 Wednesdays to deal with this material. Key concept number 1 we've already dealt with. We're going to be beholding the law of sowing and reaping. Okay, number 2. Here's key concept number 2 that we're introduced to in this verse, and that is evil companions. Does the Bible say anything about evil companionships? Yes. Be not deceived. Evil companionships corrupt what? Good morals or good manners, as the old King James had it. And now enter Jonadab. Exhibit A, if you want to talk about an evil companion. He has this friend named Jonadab. Look at verse 4. And Jonadab said to him, that is, he said to Amnon, why are you, the king's son, nonetheless, becoming thinner day after day? Now, if I ask the question a little bit differently, I think we could begin raising our hand. Have any of us, over relationship things, have any of us lost our appetite and not been able to eat for a few days and maybe lose a pound or 2? Has that ever happened to anybody? Maybe? Yeah. Okay. Well, this love sickness that Amnon has, apparently it's showing on him physically. And Jonadab says, why are you becoming thinner day after day? Will you not tell me what's going on? Verse 4. Amnon said to him, I love Tamar. I'm eat up with it. I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. I love her. It's inappropriate for me to be with her. I can't even gain access to her. I only see her, I guess, maybe in passing or whatever. He says, but it's about to kill me. He says, I'm crazy about her. I'm obsessed with her. I love Tamar, and that's my problem. Verse 5. So Jonadab said to him, listen, lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. I guess pretend to be sicker than what he really was. He really was having some troubles, but pretend to be really sick to where you can't get out of bed, I guess. And when your father, David, comes to see you, say to him, please let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand. Now, what kind of advice is this from Jonadab? It's sinful because what's he planting in Amnon's mind? The way what? The way that he can get access to this girl or this woman. Okay? The way that he can get access to her. And I don't know how many details Jonadab supplies, because verse 6 just says that Amnon took it and ran with it. Then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, news made it through the palace that, hey, David, you've got a sick son. Oh, and by the way, I haven't mentioned this little detail that's pretty critical. Amnon is the oldest of David's sons. So guess what that means about Amnon? He's crown prince. He's going to be heir. That's right. Okay? So this is old number one right here now. We're dealing with old number one. Crown prince. He's the next in line to the throne. He's getting bad advice from an evil friend, one of his cousins. So he lays down. David comes to check on him. And he says, please let Tamar, my sister, come and make a couple of cakes for me in my sight. I don't know how that's supposed to help. I want to be able to watch her make these cakes, that I may eat from her hand. When she makes these cakes, I want her to feed me. Maybe that's what he's saying. I want her to drop the food in my mouth so I can eat from her hand, and I'll feel better. Now here's spiritual concept number 3 that we're introduced to in this chapter, which is making this chapter so important. When David committed adultery with Bathsheba and ultimately had Uriah killed, did David ever practice any deception? Deception. Now, really, this third idea takes us right back here. He practiced deception, and what's going to happen to David in this chapter? He's going to be deceived, not once. Now, he's deceived once right here with Amnon. Later on, how does Amnon get killed? Because Absalom, another son, deceives his daddy. Okay? You know what I'm talking about? The law of sowing and reaping? The way my grandmother used to say it, what goes over the old devil's belly? What goes over the old devil's back comes back around under his belly. Do what? It's the law of sowing and reaping. Okay? Here, you know this. What goes around? Oh, so you're familiar with the law too. The law of sowing and reaping. Don't laugh at my grandmother. That's offensive to me. I know. What goes over the devil's back comes around under his belly. There we go. Look at verse 7. So David sent home to Tamar, saying, now go to your brother Amnon's house, and prepare food for him. Speak freely here. You know I'm picking at you. I'm not being serious, but speak freely. Raise your hand if you're scratching your head thinking, David, what are you doing? Raise your hand. All right, so I'm not the only one in the audience tonight that's thinking, exactly. I mean, this is a breach of protocol. Gwen's bringing up a good point. This is a breach of protocol because these women are sequestered, and it takes the permission of the king to let her out. And David does this. Now, what was another comment? I'm sorry. Oh, well, it probably was. If you're like I am, I can't remember it too long. What else? Any other thoughts? Folks, what does sin do now? Now, David at this point, he's been forgiven. But maybe this is an aspect of the law of sowing and reaping. I don't know. But does sin strengthen us and our mental faculties, or does sin weaken us, even weakening our mental faculties sometimes? Weakens us. Sin's not good for you. Sin's not good for you physically. Sin's not good for you psychologically. Sin's not good for you mentally. If you haven't noticed, sin's just not good for you. Okay? So here's a man that otherwise is known for his wisdom. There's evidence over in the next chapter, chapter 14, that David was known for his wisdom. And yet he's acting like a fool. He's acting like a fool. He never should have released his daughter to go and to be alone in the house of this guy. What, Gwen? Yeah, again. That's right. Oh, did you hear Jimmy? Family always seems to cloud judgment. That's a good statement. All right, let's look at our sheets. I want to answer a few questions as our time expires. Number one, Amnon's lust and Jonadab's advice. Number one under that, Amnon was the son of David, and we didn't read this in the text. I think you have to get this out of Chronicles, so I'll go ahead and give you the answer. He was the son of David by a woman named Ahinoam, Ahinoam, A-M. Ahinoam. He was David's firstborn and therefore the what? Crown prince at this time. So that's just letting you know something about Ahinoam and Amnon. Number two, Absalom and his sister were born to a different woman. Her name, and we did, no, we didn't see it in 13:1, but you can go back to chapter 3 and see it. Her name is Maacah, M-A-A-C-A-H. Maacah. So that's another bride of David. She was the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And Geshur is G-E-S-H-U-R. The king of Geshur. If you wonder where Geshur was, it was near the Sea of Galilee. It was a very small kingdom. It was not a big kingdom. It was technically Syrian. They were one of the many Syrian offshoots, the Arameans. But it was not far from the Sea of Galilee back in this ancient time. Number three, Amnon evidently allowed himself to do what? What did we use that mental term to do what on Tamar? Fixate. He allowed himself to fixate on Tamar and his lust for her. Is that healthy? No, that's not healthy. Number four, Jonadab stands as an example of the wrong kind of what? He is definitely the wrong kind of friend. In fact, Brother Alan Webster, years ago, this is one of his older tracts. We still have it. We may have it out there tonight. He wrote an entire tract on this scenario about Amnon and Jonadab. And it's a tract about evil friends. Okay? Evil friends. Great lesson here from chapter 13. Number five, Jonadab furnishes Amnon with an elaborate what? What would we call that? Plan, plot, scheme. Choose the word of your choice. He furnishes him with an elaborate plot whereby they can be alone and he can take advantage of her. And then that's where we'll stop. It's 8 o'clock, and that's really what we've covered down through question 5. So what do you have to do for the next 7 days? What do you got to do? Keep up with your sheet. Keep up with your sheet. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we'll pull them back out and we'll pick up at question number 6. And we'll keep covering this important chapter. All right, I love y'all. Have a good night, good week. And Lord willing, we hope to see you Sunday at 9:30.